the United States would have a hard time fighting the People's Liberation Army by sea and by air. It would not be the kind of war that the United States is used to.
Hello, 大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博然。Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has said the world is in a dangerous position as China's rise has pushed the United States out of the top spot, something Washington is unable to accept, and that history tells us could lead to war. But can we avoid that? Well, he hopes so and is urging the US to accept that there are now two suns in the sky. Today we'll discuss with special guest, geopolitical commentator Danny Haiphong. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Boreham in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has confirmed what we've been saying on this channel for a long time. China's meteoric rise over the past few decades so threatens US-led Western hegemony that Washington may very well resort to a hot war as it struggles to deal with a new multipolar world, where power is shared more equally around the planet and where the success or failure of any nation doesn't rely on whether or not said nation is in favour with the US international dictatorship. Very shortly we'll speak with Danny Haiphong, but first I'll fill you all in on the speech. Now, we've already seen the beginning of Washington's retaliation in the form of economic and information warfare. The former relating to debilitating sanctions and a tight grip on trade and monetary movement around the globe, and the latter relating to US control of information and news flows, plus the propensity to create and push false and harmful narratives about anyone who doesn't bow down. Case in point, the Xinjiang Uyghur conspiracy that the US and its proxies have now been pushing for years, whose ultimate goal is to destabilize the region and push it back into poverty through embargoes and sanctions, all based on the patently false idea that China's government is trying to kill off its Uyghur population. Now, I won't go into detail here, but if you haven't already, do watch my video, Why the US Wants to Destabilize Xinjiang. I'll put the link below this video. Back to the Hungarian Prime Minister, who spoke of the dynamic between the rise of China and the possibility that Washington could resort to a hot war in a desperate attempt to stay at the top. He made the remarks during an event in Romania, calling for a rational outcome as the world moves away from one led by the US hegemony into one where power is shared and where superpowers accept that and get along. Orbán said that China has been in a deep slumber for the past few hundred years, but that Beijing has woken up and managed to develop as much in a few decades as other countries have in more than 200 years. According to Daily News Hungary, Orbán believes that Washington will try to neutralize the threat like they did with the Soviet Union and European Union, which they managed to do without a hot war. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that's what Washington has been trying for at least the past few years to do, instigating tension and unrest in an attempt to weaken China and slow its progress. As just one example, the attempted colour revolution in Hong Kong fell spectacularly flat and law and order has been restored there. Viktor Orbán mentioned a scary figure about recent world history, that out of 16 power struggles between superpowers and those who challenged their position, 12 ended with war, and only 4 were resolved peacefully. War is not inevitable, but the USA does not accept that it's become the world's second most powerful nation, Orbán added. According to the Budapest Times, the Prime Minister added that the current global political trends, whether they be economic, technological development, or military power, favour Asia and China. China stands before us in full superpower attire, he said. He said the biggest question was whether a confrontation between China and the United States was avoidable. The opposing sides should recognise one another as equals regardless of the current power balance. The big players should accept that there are two suns in the sky. It's funny that he says that because that has always been China's position, even in the face of meddling, sanctions, and blatant attempts by Washington to whip China back in line. Not many in the West, especially media and politicians, pay attention to what China says, or even realize that what China says is what China does. If they did, we might be in a different and more amicable position today. So, what is it that Beijing really wants? Well, it's actually quite simple: win-win cooperation and mutual respect. China knows full well that it can't exist in the world by itself, and that healthy and respectful relations with other nations are key to a better and more stable world for everybody. The only problem is that some other states, especially the United States, don't agree and are hell-bent on stopping China's progress and the livelihoods of 1.4 billion Chinese people, instead of viewing and working with China as an equal. Okay, now I want to bring in Danny Haiphong and get his perspective. Danny, welcome to the show. Now, while you were in Shanghai recently, we met up and had a chat about the very topic of the shifting international power dynamic and whether or not you think that the US might resort to a hot war as China and the global south rise up. Now, you would have seen that Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán mentioned that in recent history, 12 of 16 similar power struggles ended in military conflict. So I really wanted to put that question to you again. What do you think are the chances that this power struggle might end up in a hot war?
Well, I think it depends on which side we look at. So on the US side, the outlook is definitely more bleak because of the United States' overall record in terms of its foreign policy. The United States has shown itself to be addicted to war from its very founding all the way into today. And of course, we know its record since World War II, becoming involved in more than 50 interventions and military operations around the world. And now we see that the United States has a great power competition strategy. It is looking at China, it is looking at Russia as the primary threats to its global supremacy. So the chances, if we look at the US side, we have so much evidence of this. We see Mike Minahan, the top Air Force general, talk about this in a leaked memo, and also on NBC News, mind you, reiterating that the US is indeed preparing for a military conflict with China. But on the other side, China has no such interest in such a conflict. China has done everything it can to negotiate, to cooperate, to use diplomacy, and also to forward a vision of multilateralism and multipolarism, which respects self-determination and sovereignty. So China does not want to see a war. The United States side, it's a lot less optimistic. But whether one will occur all depends on, I think, the global correlation of forces. How exactly do these countries maneuver around these conflicts? And I would say that if things continue to go as they're going today, then eventually the United States will pull the trigger and attempt to wage a hot war. Whether it leads to an outright conflict that Viktor Orbán is talking about remains to be seen, because as many of your viewers may know, Andy, such a conflict between the US and China could easily go nuclear, because China is a nuclear power, the US is a nuclear power, and China would have a legitimate reason to defend itself given the dangers that such a hot conflict would bring, not just for itself, but everywhere across the world. So there would be a reason to use these weapons. The United States would have a hard time fighting the People's Liberation Army by sea and by air. It would not be the kind of war that the United States is used to, and we've seen how things have gone in Ukraine. So indeed, the United States would be looking at a lot of disadvantages, and the dangers of such a conflict are so great. And I think China, if we look at the United States and China, only China really recognizes this. The United States side, it is not clear whether it can really pull back its worst excesses. So my conclusion, given things right now, would be that the United States is indeed headed this way and will eventually pull the trigger on such a conflict, unless there are dramatic changes in the US body politic.
Now, I think it's such an important question, but I did notice that some Western media just resorted to calling the Hungarian Prime Minister a nationalist and a homophobe instead of really delving into what I think are much more pressing issues, namely international peace and stability. So do you think this is par for the course, and why is it that Western media like to focus on such trivial issues, in your opinion?
Well, it really is hypocrisy, because the United States has a very clear record on all of the things that it usually accuses leaders that happen to speak out or happen to speak against its hegemonic agenda. So regardless of what one thinks of Viktor Orbán or the Hungarian prime minister or Hungarian politics, the fact of the matter is that he's exactly right here. He is right to state, because in the same speech he stated that the U.S. is not taking kindly and won't take kindly to China's rise. That is just a statement of fact. And there's a reason why someone like Viktor Orbán would say this, and it's because Hungary and China have pretty close relations. And despite Hungary being a NATO member, it doesn't have any interest in this great power conflict and doesn't want to see a war. So the reason why the United States deflects onto these issues, because it feels that everything is at the disposal. The entirety of the ideological spectrum, as well as its various tools of regime change, are on the table whenever a leader decides to speak out against U.S. hegemony and U.S. Geopolitical domination and unilateralism. Whenever a leader does this, then they become a target. And it really doesn't even matter what the facts are about Viktor Orbán's personal politics. All of this is just to delegitimize what he is trying to say here, which is that the world should not go in this direction, and that the United States, there is just an undeniable fact that it does seek to reinforce its supremacy and its hegemony worldwide, and is not taking kindly to China's rise. And that is, in fact, the biggest danger, I believe, that the world faces at this time in terms of major power conflict.
Now, going back to Viktor Orbán's speech, I was wondering what you think was the most, maybe the most important takeaway. And do you think anyone specifically in the European Union will take heed to anything that he said?
Yes. Well, I think the most important takeaway is that the world should not be going in this direction, that there should not be a growing conflict between the U.S. and China, that the United States, this hegemonic mentality, this desire to dominate the world and its narrow interests should not be the only ones at the forefront of global politics. And I think the biggest message to take away from Viktor Orbán's speech is that we should be concerned about the possibility of war. This is something that I talk a lot about because, as I said, the United States has a proven track record and actually has many different instances where, whether it's leaked memos or whether it's just its national security strategy, does have a foundation and a pathway toward war with China. And do I think that the European Union or even NATO countries will heed his words? Not so certain and not so sure, because on the one hand, you have European countries, most NATO countries. China is their biggest trading partner. China is maybe the most important country in terms of their economic development. But on the other hand, European countries have shown with the Ukraine conflict, and they've shown in many instances with the US's anti-China policies, to simply be vassals for those ends, to simply follow along, to basically put a rubber stamp on whatever the United States does, and sometimes even go further than the United States rhetorically or even in terms of policy, whether we're talking about economic trade and sanctions, or even talking about this issue of diplomacy, just talking to China or talking to Russia. Europe has oftentimes gone further to try to show the United States that it is loyal. So whether they will heed the call is a very interesting question, because it really does depend on the moment. And at this moment, neither Europe nor other NATO countries that have not been speaking up about this don't seem prepared and seem willing to, at the very least, while they may not decouple from China, they talk about de-risking and all of this, they may not want to disassociate from China, but they are also willing to go along with what the United States does, despite the fact it is contradictory to their interests. And that means that indeed they are not prepared for this moment and could very well just allow what is happening to take place. And that is to the detriment of all of Europe and really the entire world.
Now, just one more question before I let you go, and I want to switch back to the United States. Of course, you're American. So I was wondering, in your view, What needs to be done for Washington to accept a more fair world order?
Really, there needs to be a different kind of leadership, not just particular leaders. It's not about whether it's Democrat or Republican or whoever is in the White House. What really matters is the particular kind of leadership. Do people really have a say in the process of foreign policy and the policies that come out of the foreign policy establishment? Absolutely not. Do they have a say in how global politics are approached by the US government in Washington? No, not at all. And the same goes for domestic concerns. So really what is needed in the United States is a political shift, one where there is leadership. People are actually represented, their interests actually represented so that the policies can change. Until that happens, you are going to see, and we're all going to continue to see, Washington act with impunity and without any regard for the interests of people in the United States and people around the world, because at the end of the day, foreign policy is really about meeting a very narrow set of interests for a very narrow subset of the population. And that is going to continue unless the leadership changes, unless there is a true political shift. We're not talking about color revolutions or anything like this. We're talking about, do people in the United States have a voice? Does their voice matter? Do their opinions matter? Do they have any power within their own government and how their government behaves? And at the moment, all the research suggests and all the facts suggest they do not. And that is the biggest problem. And that is what needs to be tackled if U.S. foreign policy is indeed going to change significantly outside of course, the other factors worldwide that do have an impact. China's rise, all multipolarity, all of these things have a huge impact in holding Washington accountable. But Washington is a sovereign country. The U.S. is a sovereign country. So do people in the United States have a sovereign right and have an actual right and have actual power to determine politics in the U.S.? And right now, they do not.
Well, of course, the rest of the world will be watching closely. Danny Haiphong, as always, so good to see you. Thanks for coming on the show. Well, that will be it for today, you guys. But as always, I'd love to know what you think. So do let me know down below. Also, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.